You're on the speaker path, and we have Francisco Mahfuz with us today, our story specialist at Clarity Up. Hey, Francisco.
Hello, Joe.
And Francisco will react to a couple of stories that I've selected for him today from some more, some less famous TED-style talks. And I'm sure you might have seen some of them, but they'll be from a while ago. So this will be as candid as possible. All right, so here's the first one.
I'm 6 years old, and all I can think about is getting the pink Barbie Corvette. I need $5 more. Luckily for me, it's Easter, and I know that my dad always hides one coveted $5 egg. I also know the best egg is the hardest to find. This year, I'm ready. Before long, I spot it right in the middle of my sweet 70s swing set pole. You know, the one that runs along the entire top of the set. I scramble to get the ladder and the yardstick and duct tape it to a broom handle. I fish it into the pipe and I shove that egg hard. It flies out the other side, and by the time it hits the ground, I'm waiting above it like an expectant father. The egg cracks open, and inside is the very opposite of my grand prize. Instead, a perfectly formed dog turd rolls out.
Okay, let's take a minute here.
That's a pretty great line to stop at.
So, so how does this land on you?
Well, she had me at dog turd. That's a good one.
I have a friend who says inevitably any good conversation lands on this topic.
Yes,
So here we are.
Okay, so the first thing I notice is she starts straight into the story, which is a great thing. One of the worst things that people can do when they're telling stories is to have some sort of preamble, and the worst of all is, let me tell you a story. Or, once upon a time, which nobody really uses anymore, but story time or let me tell you a story are terrible. So avoid that. She starts straight in with, I don't know, 7 years old, I think it was the age. Mm-hmm. But she's using the present tense. Not everybody likes that. I think it's more of an American thing. I've been told that it's more an American thing than anywhere else in the world. I like to use it. Mm-hmm. Because it puts us straight into the story. So I'm 7 years old, and whatever she's looking for the Easter egg. So I like that beginning a lot. I think it gets us straight into the story. The story is well constructed. I think how long we listened to was about 30, 40 seconds.
Yeah, no, just over a minute, actually.
Yeah. So a couple of things there that I would have done slightly differently. One is style and the other is content. So from a style point of view, I always like to think of this, and I can now remember if I heard this from someone or if I came up with it, but I think I heard it from someone. So something called the dinner test, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, I don't like telling stories, and I don't like my clients to tell stories in a way, to an audience in a way that they wouldn't tell over dinner. Okay, I sometimes describe this as bar, not Broadway. And it's not too bad, but there's a couple of things she does where she starts going like, ooh, I'm very excited about this. And I just imagine you telling this to a friend, just one-to-one, and that would be kind of awkward. So it's okay, she doesn't overdo it. I would prefer to just be slightly more conversation, not acting. And the other thing is content. I asked you how long we've been doing this, but if she's taken a minute to go from, she's 7 years old, she's really looking forward to finding this Easter egg, and there's a dog turd in it. There's no need for a minute in there, because I don't know to this stage what is the real importance of this, other than that she really likes to find Easter eggs, right? I haven't heard anything that tells me about her character, that tells me about a talk that we're going to listen to later. And a minute, especially in a TED Talk, this is, I think I remember this TED Talk. I guess this is 14 minutes long at least, maybe 18. Maybe a minute is not that bad, and it wasn't at the time that bad to spend a minute setting it up. But nowadays, a minute out of a talk that should be about 10, 12 minutes would be suicide, right? Like, you need to get close to the interesting part of the story, the relatable part of the story quicker. And I think 30 seconds was probably enough to get to dog third.
What about this diving right in? You mentioned that as one of the highlights for you. And yet, with most of our clients, we don't actually do this. So what is up with that?
We always recommend that clients do this when they're giving a keynote or most live presentations would almost always suggest that you start with a story. There are other ways to start. I always start with the story. Brian basically never starts with a story. He does the weird hand thing that we talked about in a different episode. But on a TED Talk, it can go both ways. The challenge of a story is that if the story doesn't grab the audience straight away, on YouTube, you're taking the risk that the audience is going to go, I don't feel like listening to a story right now, and I don't really know what this talk is about. Maybe some other time, right? So with some clients, we find that it's much better to just set the premise of the talk, like tell the audience what this is about, why does it matter, why do they need to spend 10 minutes listening to this, and then go into the story. That seems to work for most people, but sometimes the story is just the best way to get started. And there's a sort of an in-between, which is you start with a line that is story-like, something about since I got to America 10 years ago and whatever, and then you immediately go into a more traditional introduction. So you can have an in-between there. So it depends on the talk, but I think that the always start with a story advice that is usually given to speakers is not as true for TED Talks as it used to be before, because people just switch off too quickly on YouTube these days.
All right. Let's see how she continues. And I'm curious what your take will be.
I burst into loud hysterics. At the same time, my father explodes with laughter. I run as fast as I can to my room, but he's not far behind. It's time for one of his talks. Honey, it was clear that you already learned the important life lesson. The harder you work, the better the payoff. So it was time that you learn another valuable lesson. Sometimes, no matter how hard you work, you just end up with shit. And who better to teach just this sort of hard-hitting, direct, and painful life lesson to 6-year-old me than my father? I'm a divorce attorney. I've been practicing for over 20 years. I began in Los Angeles, but I've owned my firm in Nevada since 2001. My firm has a particular subspecialty, men's rights.
Okay. Where are you so far?
Okay, so one thing I noticed before, and I didn't mention in the first round of comments, was there's a picture behind her. I'm not sure what that picture is about. It hasn't made a great deal of sense to me as she tells the story. I would just prefer the picture not to be there because it's somewhat distracting. I don't think that's a TEDx picture. I think it's for her talk. I don't see the point of that picture so far. It distracted me a little bit in the beginning. Second, again, a little more of the whole gestures and acting out stuff. I'm not a massive fan, especially when they're just going along things that we understand, like I'm running. Like we understand running. You don't need to mime it. And the other thing is, I like the lesson that he's getting out of it. The father seems to be my kind of father. All that's great. It's a fun little story. But as she transitions, I'm wondering if the story makes sense, right? I don't really know what that story is meant to be about yet. I mean, yes, her father taught her a valuable lesson about life, but I don't know if I remember the talk, but I can't right now connect what that story's relation to the talk is. Is it because that no matter how hard you try, you still can always get shit, to use her words? Is it about father's relationship to daughters? I don't know. Maybe in the next 3 or 4 lines she would explain it. I think ideally it would become a lot clearer, a lot faster, because otherwise I might just feel, did you just spend a minute and a half, 2 minutes telling me a cute story to introduce your father, right? So I don't know, maybe in another line she clears that, but when I'm telling a story, when a client of ours is telling a story, especially in a TEDx talk, I want the point of the story to be super clear, super fast. We don't want people going, I'm not sure what that story was really about. If she's going to come to 5, 6, 7 minutes into the talk, that is way too long, right? It should be in the next 30 seconds. Absolutely, the longest you can go is maybe 30 seconds after the story is finished for you to go, oh, I know exactly what you told me that story now. Okay, and I'm not sure if that's going to happen there. So that's something to be aware of.
So what if this was, let's say, a 30-minute talk rather than a 14-minute TEDx talk? What if this was a keynote at a conference? She goes on to say, yeah, I'm a divorce lawyer. I represent men in these, separation, custody lawsuits. And what if this was a lot longer? Would you have thought this was a more suitable story?
I mean, I think that story could be shorter anyway. Right. I think that story could be at least 30 seconds shorter.
And what makes you say that? Like, what's your process so that people who are listening or watching can have a compass to realize, oh, I'm going on for too long?
Right.
What are your cues?
My cues are that very few stories need to be, 2.5, 3 minutes long. They just don't have to. Right. In most cases, you're padding the story out with things that, if what you're putting in the story is just a lot of scene setting or very slowly moving from one thing to the other, it's not really telling me anything about you as a person. It's probably not really telling me that much about the problem that the story is meant to connect to. And there's always the risk of the audience going, I'm not really sure where this is going. Right? And that's not something you ever want. If you have an hour, that doesn't mean that now a story that should have been a minute and a half is going to be 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, because you can still lose the audience. They might not leave the room, but mentally they're checked out, and then you have to get them back later. And every time you launch into another story, which almost certainly you will in a keynote, they'll be going, oh no, another rambling story.
So don't be tempted to fill time just because you can, right?
Yes. I mean, if the question is that what needs to happen in that story so we understand, she's very excited about getting an Easter egg. I don't know why. I would have liked to know why. She starts, she's looking for it. She finds it. There's a surprise inside that her father talks to her. Like, that's it, right? Like a lot of the other stuff of like the swing set and what the swing set looked like. And like, there's a lot of stuff there to just that is kind of cutesy. Doesn't necessarily add to the story. And I think this talk, because of the subject, this was going to keep people's attention anyway. This is a female lawyer that specializes in men's rights. This is not a talk where she's probably going to lose the audience anyway, but not every TED speaker has this advantage, if you want to call it that. So the stories, Brian likes this line, a story should be as long as it needs to be and not a second longer, right?
No longer, yeah. So what would you do to upgrade this talk, knowing that the point of it, that she does make a little later, but later, is to show that fathers parent differently, and that doesn't necessarily make it worse than what mothers do in their parenting. So how would you bring that message home, starting from her story?
So again, make the story a little shorter, right? The ending is just about as good as it needs to be, right? It's very clear that that's the type of thing her father would have done. I think she missed a connecting line there that could have come, maybe comes later, it could have come earlier. I always thought my dad was a very, a particular person, or the way my dad raised me felt very unique to me. But I found out that wasn't the case. Because for the last how many years, I've been working as a men's rights lawyer, blah, blah, blah. And then I've got at least a direct connection between the story you just told about parenting styles and what you do. And now I know the story serves some purpose, right? And I could think, okay, well, you're talking about men's rights, and you just talked about how your father parents differently. I can kind of see more or less what the point there is. It's going to say there is a reason why men are important when you're raising, fathers are important when you're raising children. Then I got a glimpse of a point, right? Especially when you're telling a story, the audience needs to understand what the point of that story is. It shouldn't come 5 minutes into 6 minutes. I remember that story I told you earlier. Remember how differently my father... That shouldn't happen, right? It should be very clear straight away. You've told the story to set to make it very clear in our minds what type of father your father was, and maybe other fathers can be as well. So just quicker is just...
So connecting line, that would
Yeah.
be the chemical X in this case, and shortening the story.
Yeah. Again, this is a talk
right.
that has done very, very well. He probably did it, whatever the story... Like, I didn't remember she started this talk with a story. I have watched this talk. I remember other things from
Yeah.
it. But it didn't hurt the talk in any substantial way. But again, the topic is so interesting and potentially controversial that, you know, she would have to try very hard to lose the audience before she got into the meat of it.
Yeah, 9.3 million views from 5 years ago. So,
Yeah.
yeah. All right, let's see. I've got another really famous talk, and I chose this one not because I thought you might not know it, but it's the story of a study. And we have a lot of clients, a lot of experts who work with us who want to share their own work, and they kind of fumble around how to talk about that. And it is not so straightforward as it might seem. Like, we did this, we found out that. So I'll share a little bit of this one, and I'm curious what you think.
Time. What if we could study people from the time that they were teenagers all the way into old age to see what really keeps people happy and healthy? We did that. The Harvard study of adult development may be the longest study of adult life that's ever been done. For 75 years, we've tracked the lives of 724 men. Year after year, asking about their work, their home lives, their health, and of course, asking all along the way without knowing how their life stories were going to turn out. Studies like this are exceedingly rare. Almost all projects of this kind fall apart within a decade because too many people drop out of the study, or funding for the research dries up, or the researchers get distracted, or they die, and nobody moves the ball further down the field. But through a combination of luck and the persistence of several generations of researchers, this study has survived. About 60 of our original 724 men are still alive, still participating in the study, most of them in their 90s.
What is your take?
So the first thing that might sound surprising to some people is there's no story there. He's not told a story. He just gave us a whole bunch of statements about this particular study and studies like this, right? So he said we did that, and then if he had launched in a time marker, you know, say 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I was studying this, I was working here, and we started talking, then it would have been a story. He just gave us a whole bunch of statements, which very soon stopped being about his own study and broadened to studies of this nature. So is that the absolute best way of doing things like this? I don't think so. I think that, again, this is a super interesting talk. I've actually interviewed his coach on my podcast. And it's a super interesting talk because the subject is so interesting, right? We want to know what makes a happy life. And as long as you don't get in the way of that, people want to know what your conclusion is, right? But when it comes to telling this type of story better, I would just like the actual story. So the story could be about when did they decide to do it? Were there any conversations between him and whoever else was involved right at the start? Deciding why is this one going to be successful, right? Did they know already that most of these studies fail? And then what did they do to make them different? They could have started by sharing the story of one person, for example, going into the house of one of these people and asking them the questions. They could have started by saying, it was 10 years ago, and I'm in the lab at Harvard with one of my colleagues, and we're looking at all this data that we're just getting, and we are trying to make heads of tails of it. Because see, what we've been doing for the last 10 years, right? So you can make more of a story out of it, and is that going to be substantially more interesting than what he's doing? I guess it depends, right? It depends if there are twists and turns, if there are obstacles in the way, then you can tell it as you navigate those obstacles, and you can become a bit of a mystery story. It's like, what are these numbers telling us? Like, we don't understand. And then we have to go back, and then we talk to more people, and then the picture starts becoming clearer. It could be the story of the frustration of, as people start dropping out, maybe then you think that this is not going to work, right? There's a whole bunch of different reasons why this could be told more interestingly. Would they necessarily add to this particular talk? Maybe not to this one, but when it comes to telling stories of science, just giving us a whole bunch of statements of why this is important, why this is so difficult, and why most of this fails, that is just not going to tap into the storytelling parts of the brain that are usually going to give the audience's engagement and memory and connection to the idea, the boost that storytelling normally does.
It's funny you should say that, because actually got me pretty hooked when I thought, oh yeah, most of these things can't actually happen because it takes so many generations of researchers to make them stick and so on. So that part to me was actually lighting up my curiosity, tickling my curiosity button.
Well, this is a really interesting point. And I think we touched on this before in a different episode. It's not to say that the only thing that's going to get people curious and get people engaged is a story. That's not the point that I try to make or other people who talk up storytelling try to make. What we are saying is that you are more likely to get engagement and attention and retention of the information if you either tell a story or if you use a story format. Now, you can do it with lots of other things. You can do it with humor, you can do it with demonstrations, but for most people, the story is actually an easier way to get that much bang for your buck. So of course you can be interested and curious about someone just discussing science in a non-story way, but I think for most people that's they're just leaving a lot of potential on the table by not using a format that gives itself more to get all the impact you want.
Right. Let's play a little bit more and see if he does any better.
And we are now beginning to study the more than 2,000 children of these men. And I'm the fourth director of the study. Since 1938, we've tracked the lives of two groups of men. The first group started in the study when they were sophomores at Harvard College. They all finished college during World War II, and then most went off to serve in the war. And the second group that we've followed was a group of boys from Boston's poorest neighborhoods. Boys who were chosen for the study specifically because they were from some of the most troubled and disadvantaged families in the Boston of the 1930s. Most lived in tenements, many without hot and cold running water. When they entered the study, all of these teenagers were interviewed, they were given medical exams. We went to their homes and we interviewed their parents. And then these teenagers grew up into adults who entered all walks of life. They became factory workers and lawyers and bricklayers and doctors, one president of the United States.
Okay, I'll stop there because you get the gist.
Still no story to be found.
Still no story. So what if someone were to argue, yeah, but he goes like, first we did this, and then we did that, and then we did that. Isn't that a story?
No, it's a timeline. If you go into a company's website where it says our story, and it says, we were founded in 1937 in, Cedar Falls, Iowa, and in 1950-something we were incorporated, and in 1970-something we started opening offices abroad, and in 1997 we became the greatest company that's ever existed. That's a timeline. It's a chronology of facts. Right. Basically, he spent most of that excerpt describing the participants in the exam, in the study. And this is the trick. If you had to make a movie of that or put that on a stage for the theater, could you do it? And I think the answer there is pretty much you couldn't. Right? There's no way to do that unless you turn that into a conversation between people, right? If he's sitting down with someone and explaining to another character what happened, otherwise this is just voiceover, right? In a movie, this would be the Star Wars, wording that comes down the screen. There's no way to act this out, which doesn't mean that it's not interesting on its own. This is very interesting, but it's not a story. Okay, and
it's funny, the word that came to me was conflict. Like you said conversation, and I was going to say conflict in that moment, because that's kind of what I'm missing for this to be a story.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We want the answer, right? We want the answer to this talk. Arguably, we don't need... Most of the information that has come to us so far is not actually that relevant to finding out what the answer is later. It just means that they've talked to people, they've researched people from various backgrounds who ended up having very different lives, right? So this is just setting up the stage for the answer is still the same, right? Doesn't matter how different these people are, the answer is still the same, and that's important. But arguably, once you hear the answer, you don't feel, oh, it was super important that I got all of this background before. So if you have science that is super, super interesting, then you don't need to do as good a job at getting the audience engaged and interested. But we have clients, we have a client whose talk is about to come out any moment now, and he puts GPS trackers on whales. I mean, that is not the most relevant science to most people compared to what makes for a good life. So are you really going to watch a talk about putting GPS trackers on whales if it doesn't feel relatable to you, if the stories aren't super engaging? You probably won't. So that's the thing. Again, like the previous talk, the subject will carry the audience's interest here, but there are different ways he could have done this if he was trying to get more across to the audience in a shorter period of time, or if he was really thinking maybe they don't care, I need to keep them with me, then he could have done this in a way that was more engaging through an actual story.
He is taking his time, isn't he? Like, compared to the previous speaker, his pace is a lot slower. Like he talks in a very storytelling kind of voice, right? So it sounds like he's telling a story, even though he's giving us a timeline.
Yeah, I think he does work that he comes across like, a wise old head, right? Like he's come to us with the answer to life, literally the answer to life, the answer to a good life.
Absolutely.
And if I go up there and try to talk like me for that talk, that's not going to work. There's going to be a credibility clash there. I was like, what is this guy telling us about this stuff? And anyone older talking calmly and confidently will probably convey more credibility. And maybe this was what this talk required, is just get the information out there in a way that is easy to follow. And then, anyway, and I remember the talk from when I did the podcast, and there's some really good bits near the end. There are more imagery and things of that nature. But when it comes to the study itself, it's not markedly interesting to me. Right? It's like, okay, it's fine. I'll keep listening because I want to see where you get with it.
Like, the details themselves are interesting, but the story isn't.
It's just
really
too zoomed out. And this is another thing, right? A story involves specific human beings, usually. I mean, it could be animals, but it's typically human beings. Specific human beings doing things and talking to each other. This story is just a very... This is what history class tended to sound like for most people in school, which is why even things like the Roman Empire, which is basically, orgies and war, and drugs, sound remarkably uninteresting to teenagers, right? Who would love to play a video game
did they know.
of the actual Roman Empire. And then in history class, it's just not super interesting because it's too zoomed out, right? So he could have done this by having one of the interviews sort of acted out. He could have done this by him talking to his colleagues about it. There's lots of different moments that he could have focused on. And again, this particular research perhaps doesn't need any help being interesting, but for other science, you need to get the interest out of how you tell it and not out of just some intrinsic interest that the science has. And you know, there's lots of very good books about science that you don't care about the science, like The Big Short, or it's not science, it's economics, right? And it's impenetrable economics and finance, and it's still incredibly interesting because it's characters coming up to difficulties, and there's like, what is this thing? This seems like a catastrophe in the making, and nobody knows what it's talking about. And you know, you
Oh God, I have just the example for that.
Yeah.
It's title of the book is How to Tame a Fox and Build a Dog.
Interesting.
I mean, seriously.
Interesting.
So before I digress any further, Francisco, your like top 3 things for any scientist to do in order to tell the story of their study or of their science.
I tend to find that you're either telling us about the discovery of the problem that leads into the science, or you're telling about this big mystery, this unexplained thing, or this very unsurmountable challenge that is happening somewhere into the study or the research, right? So it's either I found this problem in the real world, or somebody brought me this problem in the real world, and then I started studying it. So that's a fairly common one. And the other one is I was studying this thing, and it was pretty straightforward, right? We're doing this, we're interviewing some people, but then we started finding there was some really strange stuff coming up in the data. And I remember one day I walked into my colleague's office and I'm like, listen, am I just reading this wrong? Because this doesn't make any sense. And then you just sort of get the audience to go, oh, hold on, there's something happening here that might be interesting.
That tension.
So yeah, discovering when you discover the subject of your study, or when the results start sounding unbelievable, or you know, just nothing you could ever have expected, that tends to be one of the best ways to make a study a little more interesting than just, you know, talking about the problem, talking about the results.
Okay, I have got a real clicker now, and I'm pretty sure you've seen this one. So 2 stories here that we're going to hear very quickly, one after the other.
Right.
So my patient Fernando, he's plagued. He goes on. I thought I knew my life. I thought I knew who you were, who we were as a couple, who I was. Now I question everything. Infidelity, a violation of trust, a crisis of identity. Can I ever trust you again, he asks. Can I ever trust anyone again?
That was story number 1.
She's using dialogue, which is one of the best ways to tell stories, because it's easier to give emotion to the story by just putting more inflection in your volume and variety in your voice than it is by almost anything else, right? I think we don't need to be particularly great actors to say something sounding angry or impatient. I think most people can do that fairly well, which is one of the reasons why dialogue is very helpful. The other thing dialogue does is it allows you to sound like a normal person speaking and just leave a lot of context out, but we can infer what the context is, right? It's like, I mean, this is a talk about infidelity. I'm assuming that what the guy is referring to is that his partner was unfaithful, right? But she doesn't need to spell out anywhere near as much as if she tries to say this without a dialogue. It would sound like, so I was talking to my patient Fernando, and Fernando was talking to his girlfriend, wife, husband, whatever. And Fernando was telling his husband that now that he's been, like, it's just so cumbersome to say it, right? Whereas if you just says, and Fernando says,
I want to yawn
yes,
just listening.
Yeah, it's just, he said,
yeah.
Now that he has been unfaithful, who is he? You know, just like it was Fernando that's unfaithful, the partner was unfaithful. It's awful. And if you do it in dialogue, it's very easy to understand and very quick. So yeah, that's great.
Very relatable,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Okay. Story number 2.
And this is also what my patient Heather is telling me when she's talking to me about her story with Nick, married, 2 kids. Nick just left on a business trip. And Heather is playing on his iPad with the boys. when she sees a message appear on the screen. Can't wait to see you. Strange, she thinks, we just saw each other. And then another message. Can't wait to hold you in my arms. And Heather realizes these are not for her. She also tells me that her father had affairs, but her mother, she found one little receipt in the pocket and a little bit of lipstick on the collar. Heather, she goes digging, and she finds hundreds of messages and photos exchanged and desires expressed. The vivid details of Nick's 2-year affair unfold in front of her in real time.
Okay. What are the differences between the two stories so far?
So on the second one, she gives way more context, but she does it fairly quickly, right? She says, Heather is telling me about her story with Nick. Nick, married 2 kids. Nick is going on a business
Married
trip.
2 kids. Yeah, that was so effective.
It's very short.
That line.
It's very rapid fire. Then you have something that you could easily put on a movie screen, which is she's on the iPad. It's like on his iPad with the boys, and I shook my head. It's like that is never a great idea. And then the message comes in and made me remember that exact thing. Well, not exact, but very similar thing happened to my father. That's when he learned that connecting his phone and his iPad to his wife's iPad wasn't a good idea. In my father's case, it was innocent. It was just a friend of him kind of being a bit loose with his language about so many good-looking women in this, boring dinner we're going to. It wasn't an affair. But yes, not a great idea. So that's great. And then she does something else that it's not my personal preference, but she pulls it off very well, which is the language that she's using becomes slightly more poetic. So she says at one point a line that I thought was great. She says, photos exchanged and desires expressed. Right? So it's not language I would normally like to use because it sounds a little fancy for my liking. But there it worked super well because she managed to get a lot across in just one line.
Yeah,
right?
Another of these really economical expressions that she has, and it's kind of padded with a lot of normal language.
Yeah. And then she got out of. She went into a more descriptive type of story, and I talked about her mom, and the mom found this, and the mom found specific details as well. It wasn't her mom found proof of her father's infidelity. It was her mom found a receipt in a pocket and lipstick on the collar. Right, which is way more powerful than saying her mom also found proof of Heather's father's infidelity.
I don't know about you, but every time I see this talk and I hear these snippets, these moments in time, I feel a pang in my stomach because it kind of takes me back to similar experiences that I've had. It's very realistic for me.
This is something that it's very difficult to understand conceptually. It doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about it. But it's this idea that specific is universal, right? Maybe you've been in a relationship where someone was unfaithful, and maybe there was no receipt in the pocket or lipstick on the collar or message on the iPad, but there was something. And as soon as you hear the details of Heather's relationship, it immediately takes you to what happened in your relationship, and you go, oh, I never found lipstick on a collar. What I found was this, right? Mm-hmm. And for some reason, if she just said, and Heather's mom found proof of her father's infidelity, your brain struggles to go, it's like, proof of her infidelity. What proof? Did she walk in on him? Did she,
suddenly a lot more vague.
Yeah, it's like, what kind of proof? Whereas if you tell us what the proof was, you go, oh, this type of you didn't cover your tracks well enough type of proof. Okay, that is what, it's very different than, I don't know, got a detective to take photos of him, right? So it's difficult for people to realize this and stick to it, but the more specific you are, the more real your story feels, because it doesn't, obviously you could just make that up, but it doesn't feel like you're making that up. And it is easier for other people to substitute the details in your story for the details in their story and put themselves in that position, right? And you notice this in movies and TV shows all the time. Like you see, parents with sick kids, or someone loses a partner or whatever, right? Even if the situation is not one that you've ever lived, maybe it's an elderly parent, right? This was, I was watching Welcome to Wrexham the other day, and it's at some point it's the daughter and the mom, and their father, who's like 71, is on a football game. And there is someone falls sick in the football game. They have to send in an ambulance, and they can't get a hold of their father and husband. And they start wondering if it's him that's sick, right? And you can see how much they're suffering through it. And I mean, I've not ever had that situation in my life, but I can feel what that would feel like because it's a very specific situation. It probably wouldn't be the same because my dad doesn't go to football games anymore, but I can imagine the loss of the thinking that I'm losing a parent in that kind of situation. Whereas if they just said, my dad fell ill and I thought I was going to lose him, it just doesn't have the same impact.
Yeah, it's much more neutral,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, let's see how she drives it home.
And it made me think, affairs in the digital age, a death by 1,000 cuts. But then we have another paradox that we're dealing with these days. Because of this romantic ideal, we are relying on our partner's fidelity with a unique fervor. But we also have never been more inclined to stray. And not because we have new desires today, but because we live in an era where we feel that we are entitled to pursue our desires.
Okay, and then she goes on and gets a little bit more researchy.
Yeah, so no, she's not telling a story there anymore. She's just going into...
It's kind of driving her point home.
She's going into
right?
talk mode. But she does one thing there that I think it's very powerful, and it can be not necessarily a replacement for telling a story, but it's one way to get a little more of that storytelling goodness without having to make everything a story, which is she uses a metaphor. She uses the metaphor of, death by 1,000 paper cuts or 1,000 cuts, as she simplifies it. And most people would probably know what that expression is. And then you're doing a lot of gymnastics to connect that metaphor to the thing she's just describing. And it triggers similar areas of the brain, gets similar results. And this is something that is great in replacement of a story, when you cannot tell a story, but it's also great when you use it from a story you previously told, right? So she can later in the talk bring back the receipt in the pocket or the lipstick on the collar. In the first video you showed me, I don't know how many times she wants to be talking about dog turds, right? But she could bring back the dog turd as a metaphor for something else, right?
That's every little word.
Every father has his dog turd moment, right? Yeah. It's a way to bring back the story and use it, turn it into a metaphor. One that I've shared a few times, in podcasts. I don't think I've shared in our podcast, maybe, was the whole make the penguin suffer. Right, a student of mine...
Oh, yeah, we've talked about that. Yeah,
a student of mine told a story about a penguin and resolved it too quickly. And my feedback to him was, you need to make the penguin suffer. And all the students immediately understood what that meant. And I always tell that story to my students in the MBA. And sometimes they will give it as feedback. They would say, I think he needed to make the penguin suffer more.
So it's like a shortcut.
Yes, it becomes a
already
short...
brings with all the kind of the moral of the story, the context, everything that people need to know, but just in those couple of words.
Yeah. So that's something you can always do to get more value out of a story you told earlier in your talk without having to say, remember when I told you. You can just pick the main sort of symbol of the story and use it to get all of that meaning back in a way that is very quick and still hits fairly hard.
What is Esther doing really well that our viewers or listeners should take away? And if you were to offer an upgrade, not that Esther Perel needs any kind of support for her keynote speaking, but in a parallel universe where she would want our consulting, what is one thing that you would offer?
Well, based on this snippet, there isn't a ton that I think she would need to upgrade. I think what she's doing very well is she's using real life examples to make her point. She's picking client stories. I'm sure she's changing some of the details so people can't be recognized, but she's telling them with dialogue. She's telling them with very specific scenes, very specific details, which makes it very, very memorable. And it gets a lot of meaning across in a short period of time. I mean, that's the most important thing she's doing there. What I think maybe could be improved, but again, it would depend on what exactly is the talk that she's trying to give, is the slightly more poetic literary language doesn't always work in every single context. I think sometimes it goes well with a person's style, but I'm curious if she was giving a keynote and not a slightly shorter TED Talk, would that not start sounding a bit... One, would it start sounding a little weird after a while? And two, it's just much harder to do, right? Because you need your writing to be much, much better. And most people don't write a keynote or even a longer workshop the way they would write a short talk, right? You can pepper it with literary sentences in a short talk, and that's fine, right? It's a performance. But I don't think you can just get up on stage and fill an hour and a half and have the vast majority of your talking be at that level, right? It's just not... And it would require her to memorize it, because nobody talks that way, right? Yeah. So
you need to deliver those lines exactly right.
Yes. Yeah, so the more conversational your style is, both in delivery and content, the easier it is for you without necessarily it costing you anything. When it comes to how much the audience gets it. It might even improve it. The more literary style can work very well, much harder to write, harder to deliver in a way that lands, and it doesn't always work. It's not always the best thing for the audience.
Yeah, and for our clients, I guess, and experts more broadly, just because we see this one example where it works really well doesn't mean that it's going to work really well in every other example, right?
Most people feel weird trying to talk that way. It just doesn't work, and it's one of the reasons why when it comes to things like using ChatGPT or any other type of AI, often it just doesn't sound like a person speaking. And it's getting better at that, but it might not sound like you speaking. And you know how to speak. You might as well just speak without worrying so much about a specific script and specific sentences. The odd one here and there obviously can be something you practice and deliver if it packs more punch. But I wouldn't think that for most people, trying to talk the way she's talking here is going to be the best approach for them.
All right. So that was 3 stories with Francisco's comments. If anybody out there listening or watching us would love us to react to their own talks or other talks, make sure to send them our way. We would love to do that. And Francisco, what are your what's one line that you would like people to remember from today?
It's a lot easier to tell stories that work if you make sure there is always dialogue and people actually doing things. That's it.
All right. I love that. Dialogue and people doing things. That also makes things move in the story, right? Yeah, fantastic. Well, thanks for that, Francisco, and I'll see you on the speaker path.